Hey, I am the Funded and today I would like to tell you about level of detail, LoD for short. This is not a tutorial but a video about what you need to know for your 3D game. There is not only one solution but several approaches, and I will address the most popular of them. And maybe also what you should pay attention to when you work with this. Level of detail is, as the name suggests, purely a statement about level of detail of the 3D models. There are several approaches how to deal with this. Basically, however, they can be divided into two categories: dynamic and static levels of detail. How this works exactly comes in a later part of the video. The goal is always to have and show only as much detail as is necessary. Games often use multiple techniques to deal with level of detail. This video shows examples of this from various games. The first question, before we even start looking at concepts, is: do you even need this in your game? The simple answer is yes, because as a developer you always want to have the best performance for your players. Therefore, you shouldn't waste resources unnecessarily on anything that doesn't get more than 1000 pixels in the background. If we want to actively work with LoD, it is very easy with modern game engines. No matter which of the options mentioned below we want to use, this is usually already built in directly, so only little extra effort is necessary. When you hear LoD, you automatically think of the images with 2 to 5 levels. Each level represents a level of detail. This is switched depending on the distance to the camera. You can think of it in a simplified way that all LoD models are loaded on the same position. Depending on the distance, the relevant model is made visible and all others invisible. Accordingly, nowadays LoD versions can be generated in game engines directly when importing a model. See the example in the background with Godot 4. So it is no longer necessary for the 3D artist to create multiple versions manually. However, self-created LoD models are still in use in various games. They make sense when the generated LoD is not good enough for the purpose. What is important with these models is that they keep the color, shape and silhouette in the distance. If possible, it should not be noticeable to the player when the models change. How many levels it takes depends on the game and the scenery. For example, if it is a scene with a house that cannot be left far, low LoD levels are not necessary. However, not every model needs to be implemented as previously described. If chunks are used, for example, it may not be necessary, since other parts are completely faded in and out. This can already bring enough performance depending on the game and requirements. There, however, you may have to create separate models for areas in the background that are seen. Here, however, a very simple 3D model is usually sufficient, or one uses the previously described phases. This is especially relevant if you have points of interest like high buildings or special terrain. This technique with chunks can be very good, but has the disadvantage that you cannot create places where you can see a large part of the game world. For example, from a hill. Another example where you don't need LoD levels is when you display certain things only after a certain distance from the player at all. This is mainly done with small vegetation, vehicles or debris, so all things that are not necessary for the gameplay. And of course, for things that are always in focus, it doesn't need LoD models. For example, the game character, weapons or the like. However, it may also be that only small levels are used in general. Here in the example with 2 tracks for Mario Kart 8. These have already been built by default with low polygons and optimal conditions, and therefore do not need LoD. If you look at the wireframe, you can see that only in places where you drive, a lot of details were used. The further away you get from the track, the less detail is used. One of the lowest LoD levels you can make is a simple plane model with a picture on it. You can use this especially if you are very static in the map or are limited to a small part. This has the advantage that it requires very few resources and is therefore suitable for devices with limited power. This technique was used very intensively in old games, but still finds its application today, often adding a few vertices to have a slight curvature. In addition to all the stuff we've seen so far, there are also dynamic LoD, which is calculated live in-game. This is very popular for terrain where a higher density of vertices is used depending on the distance. If you are interested, you can find many examples on YouTube based on height maps. Another well-known example is Nanite from the Unreal Engine. This calculates the LoD levels similar to terrain directly for 3D models. Although you get a lot of freedom here and you could get the idea to load raw 3D models into it, you should be careful with it. There are many people who don't have the memory or hardware to do this. Looking at Steam player stats, the average gamer has a GTX 1060 and only up to 250 GB of storage. Therefore, you should think twice to allow a larger player base to play the game. In addition to that, I would like you to always remember to use the PBR workflow. Most important to save resources are normal maps. With this you can make even the most detailed models more resource efficient. Let's try to repeat that again with what we have learned. This is based on a picture from the real world. If you are interested, it is from Ascona in Switzerland. We assume a static position so that we cannot move to the back. Also, we ignore the water because you will solve that with a plane and a shader. Starting with the terrain on the left and right, it would be a good idea to use a terrain plugin with a height map. Although we don't need the details in the back anymore, it is more efficient to create this than with a separate 3D model. For the buildings, we use LoD levels. This way you will use the higher or lower levels of detail depending on the distance to the camera. It is worth using buildings with LoD levels because they can be easily reused in the background. I will make an exception for the small island on the water. This is a special point of interest, which therefore gets a lot of attention. Here I will use more details despite the distance. For details like clouds or the mountains in the background, simple planes can be used. That's it. If you have a question, just write it in the chat and I will try to answer as soon as possible. If you liked the video, I would be happy about a like. I hope to see you at the next video. Bye!